What if your neighbor was accused of witchcraft? What if a simple comment, a sideways glance, could cost you your life? Between the 15th and 17th centuries, fear transformed into Europe's most powerful weapon. Thousands of people, primarily women, were condemned to death under accusations of making pacts with the devil. This wasn't just a hunt, it was institutionalized terror at its most brutal. Imagine walking through your village, knowing that at any moment someone could point their finger at you. The whispers would start, suspicions would grow, and before long, you might find yourself facing impossible accusations with no way to prove your innocence. In those dark times, the line between life and death was terrifyingly thin. A woman who knew too much about herbal remedies, a widow who inherited property, or simply someone who didn't conform to society's expectations, all could become targets. In fact, over 80% of those executed for witchcraft were women, many of them elderly, poor, or socially vulnerable. The witch-hunting phenomenon spread like wildfire across Europe, from Germany, where the persecution was particularly severe, to England, Scotland, and eventually the American colonies. The infamous witch trials in Salem might be the most well-known today, but they were just a small part of a much larger, more horrifying chapter in human history. Consider this chilling reality. In some small German towns, the witch hunts were so thorough that almost no women remained. In the Prince-Bishopric of Bamberg, about 1,000 people were burned as witches between 1625 and 1631, in a population of just a few thousand. What made these persecutions so effective was how they twisted the fabric of communities. Neighbors accused neighbors. Children testified against parents. The accused, under unimaginable torture, named others, anything to stop the pain. One accusation could trigger a cascade of deaths. The methods used to identify witches defied all logic and humanity. Women were stripped, shaved, and searched for devil's marks. Any mole, birthmark, or scar could be considered evidence. They were subjected to swimming tests, where they were bound and thrown into water. Floating was proof of guilt, sinking proof of innocence, though many innocent women drowned before they could be declared not a witch. Behind this madness lay a toxic brew of religious fervor, misogyny, political upheaval, and climate change. The Little Ice Age had brought crop failures and famine, and people desperately needed someone to blame. Women, especially those with knowledge or independence, became perfect scapegoats. What makes this history so haunting isn't just the enormous death toll, but how ordinary people participated in extraordinary cruelty, all while believing they were doing good, protecting their communities from evil. The witch hunts remind us of humanity's darkest potential, how fear can transform neighbors into monsters, how prejudice can disguise itself as justice, and how the machinery of persecution, once set in motion, is nearly impossible to stop. So the next time you hear about witches riding broomsticks or casting spells, remember the real horror story, not of supernatural evil, but of human fear unleashed upon the innocent. Words have power. Sometimes a single sentence can shape centuries of history and condemn thousands to death. That's exactly what happened with one particular biblical verse. "Thou shalt not suffer a witch to live." These 7 words, found in the book of Exodus, chapter 22, verse 18, became one of the deadliest sentences ever written. Originally penned thousands of years ago in ancient Hebrew, this command was later translated, reinterpreted, and weaponized in ways its original authors could never have imagined. What's fascinating and horrifying is how these words lay dormant for over 1,000 years before they were suddenly seized upon with murderous fervor in the 15th century. Why then? What changed? The medieval church was facing unprecedented challenges. The devastating Black Death had killed nearly 1/3 of Europe's population. Religious reformers were questioning church authority, and a new intellectual movement was threatening the established order. The church needed scapegoats, and this obscure biblical passage provided the perfect justification. But here's what many people don't know. The original Hebrew word that was translated as witch actually referred to someone who used poison to harm others, not someone who cast magical spells or flew on broomsticks. It was about actual harmful actions, not supernatural abilities. This crucial mistranslation had deadly consequences. In 1486, two German Dominican monks, Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger, published what would become the most influential witch-hunting manual ever created, Malleus Maleficarum, or The Hammer of Witches. This book, which quoted that biblical verse extensively, provided detailed instructions on how to identify, interrogate, and execute suspected witches. The Malleus Maleficarum wasn't just any book. It received the official blessing of Pope Innocent VIII through a papal bull and was second only to the Bible in sales throughout Europe for almost 200 years. Imagine that, a torture manual becoming a bestseller. With the invention of the printing press, this deadly text spread rapidly across Europe, appearing in 29 editions in multiple languages. It became the handbook for witch hunters everywhere, providing religious and legal justification for the slaughter that followed. The consequences were devastating. Historians now estimate that between 40,000 and 60,000 people were executed for witchcraft during this period, and roughly 80% of them were women. That's more than the entire population of many medieval cities. Imagine whole towns emptied of their female inhabitants. What makes this even more disturbing is that many of these executions were carried out with meticulous legal documentation. These weren't mob lynchings. They were systematic state-sponsored killings, complete with trials, testimony, and detailed records, all justified by a misinterpreted 7-word verse. In some regions, the persecution reached unimaginable levels. In the small German town of Wiesensteig, 63 women were burned at the stake in a single year, 1592. In the tiny village of Obermarschtal, all but 2 women were executed as witches. The power of this biblical verse wasn't just in what it said, but in how it was used. Church authorities insisted it was their sacred duty to purge witchcraft from Christian lands. Political leaders used witch trials to eliminate enemies and seize property, and ordinary people, terrified of supernatural threats, demanded protection from those they believed had allied with the devil. It's a chilling reminder of how religious texts, taken out of context and twisted to serve political ends, can unleash unimaginable horror. A single mistranslated sentence became the foundation for centuries of persecution, proof that sometimes the most dangerous weapon isn't a sword or cannon, but a carefully chosen line of text wielded by those in power. Forget everything you think you know about witches. The pointed hats, the bubbling cauldrons, the magical spells. These were inventions that came much later. The real victims of the witch hunts were nothing like the Halloween caricatures we see today. So who exactly were these so-called witches? They weren't cackling old women brewing potions in the forest. They were your neighbors, your healers, your midwives, ordinary women whose only crime was often being different in some way that made the powerful uncomfortable. Let's look at the midwives first. These women brought new life into the world in an era when childbirth was incredibly dangerous. They knew which herbs could ease pain, how to turn a breech baby, how to stop bleeding. This knowledge, passed down from woman to woman for generations, seemed mysterious to men who were excluded from the birthing room. And when a baby died, as many did in those days before modern medicine, it was all too easy to blame the midwife rather than accept the harsh realities of infant mortality. One famous case was that of Agnes Sampson, a respected Scottish midwife who was accused of witchcraft in 1590. King James VI himself, who would later sponsor the King James Bible, oversaw her torture and execution. Her crime? being too successful at her work, which made people wonder if her skills came from supernatural sources. Then there were the healers and wise women. In a world without doctors for common people, these women were the pharmacists, the nurses, and the therapists all rolled into one. They knew which plants could bring down a fever, which poultices could draw out infection, which teas could calm a troubled mind. This knowledge, this science really, was viewed with deep suspicion, especially by the emerging male medical profession who saw these women as competition. The most famous medicinal witch was probably Mother Shipton from England, who lived in the early 16th century. Her knowledge of herbal medicine was so extensive that people traveled for days to consult her. Eventually, her reputation for healing led to accusations of supernatural powers, though she was one of the lucky few who died naturally before she could be executed. Widows and single women formed another large group of victims. In societies where women were defined by their relationships to men as daughters, wives, and mothers, those who lived independently raised suspicions. How could a woman survive on her own unless she had made some unholy bargain? When a widow inherited property from her husband, suddenly she might find herself accused of witchcraft, and, conveniently, her property would be confiscated by the authorities. The case of Gaylis Duncan in Scotland illustrates this perfectly. When her husband died, leaving her a comfortable inheritance, she was quickly accused by a jealous neighbor. Under torture, she confessed to witchcraft and was executed in 1591. Her property was divided between her accuser and the local magistrate. Perhaps most threatening of all were women who simply refused to conform to society's expectations. The outspoken woman who argued with authority. The woman who rejected a suitor. The woman who dressed differently or lived differently. In the deeply hierarchical societies of early modern Europe, any deviation from established norms could mark you as dangerous. Take Anne Boleyn, second wife of King Henry VIII of England. While she wasn't formally tried as a witch, she was accused of witchcraft among her other alleged crimes. Her intelligence, her outspokenness, and her influence over the king made people whisper that she must have used magic to enchant him. What's striking is how many of the accused shared certain characteristics. They were predominantly female, often older, frequently poor or marginalized, but sometimes just unusually independent or knowledgeable. In Sweden, over 85% of those executed were women. In Iceland, it was almost 90%. Yet there's a cruel irony here. The very qualities that made these women valuable to their communities, their knowledge, their skills, their independence, were the same qualities that made them vulnerable to accusation. The midwife who saved countless lives could be burned as a witch if a single birth went wrong. The healer who cured dozens could be hanged if one patient died. And so, village by village, town by town, Europe and later America deprived themselves of some of their most knowledgeable, skilled, and independent women, all in the name of fighting an imaginary evil. The real tragedy of the witch hunts wasn't just the lives lost, but the knowledge, wisdom, and potential that died with them. Imagine being accused of a crime that's impossible to disprove, a crime that exists only in the imagination of your accusers. This was the nightmarish reality for those accused of witchcraft, and the methods used to investigate these accusations were nothing short of torture disguised as justice. Let's start with one of the most infamous, the water test, or what they called swimming a witch. Picture this scene. A woman, her thumbs tied to her opposite big toes, creating a contorted ball of humanity, is dragged to the nearest river or pond. A crowd has gathered to witness the spectacle. With ceremonial solemnity, she's lowered into the cold water. If she floats, she's declared guilty of witchcraft. The water, considered pure, was said to reject the impure witch. If she sinks, she's innocent, but might drown before anyone can pull her out. It was a deadly catch-22 that claimed countless lives. In 1612, in the English town of Northampton, A woman named Mary Sutton was subjected to this test 3 times in one day. Each time she floated, sealing her fate. What the crowd didn't understand was simple physics. Her bound position trapped air in her clothing, causing her to float just as a ball would. She was executed shortly after, another victim of pseudoscience masquerading as divine judgment. Then there was the search for the devil's mark, perhaps the most invasive and humiliating of all witch-finding methods. Accused women were stripped naked, every inch of their bodies examined by self-appointed experts, looking for any unusual mark that could be declared a sign of their pact with Satan. These so-called devil's marks could be anything: birthmarks, moles, scars, or even freckles. In Scotland, professional prickers would use special needles to stab these marks. If the spot didn't bleed or if the woman didn't feel pain, this was considered proof of guilt. What we now know is that many witch prickers use trick needles, ones where the blade retracted into the handle, creating the illusion that the needle was penetrating the skin without causing bleeding. One notorious pricker, John Kincaid, was responsible for sending dozens of Scottish women to their deaths before he was finally exposed as a fraud in 1662. By then, of course, his victims were long dead. But perhaps most horrifying of all were the confessions extracted through torture. Sleep deprivation, starvation, and physical agony were standard techniques. The accused would be kept awake for days, their minds clouding, hallucinations setting in. Eventually, they would confess to anything just to end their suffering. In Germany, witch hunters developed specialized torture devices. The pear of anguish was inserted into various orifices and then expanded. The breast ripper was exactly what it sounds like, and the strappado involved hanging someone by their arms tied behind their back, often dislocating both shoulders. Under such conditions, who wouldn't confess? And once you confessed, you were asked to name your accomplices, other witches you had seen at Sabbaths and black masses. This created a domino effect, where one confession led to dozens more accusations. In the infamous Bamberg witch trials in Germany, one tortured woman named over 600 accomplices before she was executed. Almost all of them were subsequently arrested. What's particularly chilling is how many of these methods were conducted as public spectacles. Witch trials weren't hidden away, they were community events. Neighbors watched neighbors being tortured. Children witnessed parents confessing to impossible crimes. These weren't just methods of investigation. They were performances designed to reinforce fear and obedience. The executioner of Bamberg, Franz Schmidt, kept a detailed diary of his work from 1573 to 1617. He described how the crowds would gather for witch examinations, sometimes numbering in the thousands. Vendors sold food and drink as if at a fair. For many, these were social occasions, entertainment with a moral message. This theater of terror served a purpose beyond simply identifying witches. It was a demonstration of power, a warning to anyone who might challenge authority. The message was clear. This could happen to you next. Conform, obey, don't stand out. When we look at the methods used to discover witches, we're not seeing investigation at all. We're seeing torture systems specifically designed to produce guilt. There was no way to prove innocence. The deck was stacked, the game rigged, the outcome predetermined. It wasn't justice, it was performance art, written in blood and screams. Picture a cold New England winter in 1692. The snow is deep, the nights are long, and in the small Puritan settlement of Salem Village, something terrible is brewing. What begins with the strange behavior of 2 young girls will spiral into one of history's most notorious examples of mass hysteria, a madness that will claim 20 innocent lives and forever haunt American history. It all started in the home of Salem's minister, Reverend Samuel Parris. His 9-year-old daughter Betty and her 11-year-old cousin Abigail Williams began experiencing bizarre fits. They screamed uncontrollably, threw objects, contorted their bodies into impossible positions, and complained of being pinched and bitten by invisible forces. Local doctor William Griggs had no medical explanation for their symptoms and offered a chilling diagnosis. The girls were under the influence of witchcraft. When pressed to name who was bewitching them, the girls first accused Tituba, the Paris family's Caribbean slave, who had entertained them with fortune-telling games and stories from her homeland. They also named Sarah Good, a homeless beggar, and Sarah Osborne, an elderly woman who rarely attended church. These were safe targets, marginalized women with little social standing. But what began as potentially calculated accusations quickly erupted into something far more dangerous. Soon, the afflicted girls grew to include other young women in the community: Ann Putnam Jr., Mercy Lewis, Mary Walcott, and Elizabeth Hubbard among them. And their accusations expanded beyond the social outcasts to respected community members. Here's what many people don't realize about Salem. This wasn't just about superstition. Salem Village was a community under immense stress. They had recently lost their political autonomy to Salem Town. They had no official charter from England. They faced constant threat of attack from Native American tribes. A smallpox epidemic had recently ravaged the area, and bitter property disputes divided neighbor from neighbor. These tensions erupted through the witch trials. The majority of those accused were either wealthy landowners whose property others coveted, or their defenders, or they were related to the wrong families in ongoing feuds. The supernatural became the perfect weapon in very worldly conflicts. Take the case of Rebecca Nurse, a 71-year-old respected church member. Her family was involved in a land dispute with the powerful Putnam family, and the Putnam's daughter became one of her primary accusers. Despite dozens of community members vouching for her character, she was hanged on Gallows Hill. Then there was Giles Corey, an 81-year-old farmer who refused to enter a plea when accused of witchcraft. According to English law, he couldn't be tried without entering a plea. To force a confession, he was subjected to an especially brutal form of torture called pressing. Heavy stones were piled on his chest, gradually crushing him. Even as he was dying, when asked to confess, his only words were, "More weight." He died after 2 days of this torture, his last act of defiance, ensuring his property would pass to his children rather than be seized by the state. The trials themselves were a mockery of justice. The primary evidence was spectral evidence, claims by the afflicted girls that they could see the accused spirits or specters tormenting them. The accused had no right to legal representation. Many were kept in chains in dungeon-like conditions for months while awaiting trial. During the court proceedings, whenever the accused spoke in their own defense, the afflicted girls would fall into fits, screaming that the witch was attacking them that very moment. How could anyone defend against such tactics? By the end, 14 women and 6 men had been executed. 5 more, including 2 infants, died in the filthy, overcrowded prisons. One of the executed, Bridget Bishop, was known for wearing a red bodice, considered scandalously inappropriate in Puritan society. Her fashion choices were actually cited as evidence against her. What finally ended the madness? The accusations began to reach too high. When the afflicted girls accused the Massachusetts governor's wife, prominent Boston ministers stepped in and prohibited the use of spectral evidence. Without their primary form of proof, the trials collapsed. In 1697, Massachusetts declared a day of repentance for the Salem Witch Trials. Judge Samuel Sewall publicly apologized for his role. Ann Putnam Jr., one of the primary accusers, later issued a public confession of guilt for her role in the deaths of innocent people. But for the 20 executed, these apologies came too late. Their stories stand as a stark reminder of how quickly a community can descend into madness when fear overrides reason, when personal vendettas find expression through mob justice, and when the vulnerable become scapegoats for a society's deeper anxieties. Incredible, isn't it? Did you know that a single accusation could mean certain death? Like this video, share it, and tell us in the comments, what would you do if you were accused of witchcraft. When we talk about witch hunts, it's easy to frame the story as men persecuting women. And while that's largely true, the reality holds a more complex and disturbing truth. Women themselves were often enthusiastic participants in the witch-finding frenzy, sometimes becoming the most vicious accusers, witnesses, and even examiners of other women. This uncomfortable reality challenges our assumptions. Why would women turn against their own? What could drive them to condemn neighbors, friends, and sometimes even family members to torture and death? Let's start with the teenage girls of Salem, Massachusetts. The initial accusations came from 9-year-old Betty Paris and 11-year-old Abigail Williams, but they were quickly joined by other young women. Ann Putnam Jr., just 12 years old, became one of the most prolific accusers, eventually naming over 60 people as witches. At her trial testimony against Rebecca Nurse, Anne fell to the ground writhing and screaming whenever the accused woman looked in her direction. What drove her performance? Some historians believe Anne was manipulated by her parents to target their enemies in property disputes. Others suggest she found power and attention in a society where young girls were expected to be silent and obedient. For many women, accusing others of witchcraft provided a rare taste of authority in a world where they had little. Suddenly, their words carried weight in courts and communities dominated by men. They were listened to, believed, and treated as important. For someone who had spent her life being dismissed and ignored, this could be intoxicating. In England, prominent witch hunter Matthew Hopkins employed several women as searchers, women who examined the bodies of accused witches for devil's marks. These female examiners would strip the accused naked, shave all body hair, and probe every intimate crevice for any unusual marks. Mary Phillips, one such searcher in Essex County, testified against dozens of women in the 1640s. Court records reveal she was paid 2 shillings and sixpence for each woman she examined, a significant sum that provided financial independence in an era with few opportunities for women to earn money. Fear also played a powerful role. In the small village of Obermarschthal in Germany, when Maria Holl was accused of witchcraft in 1693, she quickly named 4 other women as accomplices to save herself from further torture. These women in turn accused others. The pattern repeated until more than women in the village had been executed, all from an initial accusation that had likely been motivated by spite or jealousy. Social climbing and status improvement motivated others. When Lady Frances Howard, Countess of Essex, accused Anne Turner of witchcraft in 1615, she eliminated a rival while elevating her own standing at the royal court of King James I. Anne was hanged, and Frances enjoyed increased favor with the king, who was famously obsessed with witchcraft and had even written a book on the subject called Demonology. Perhaps most disturbing were the professional female witch hunters. Women like Janet Wishart in Scotland made careers out of identifying witches, developing a reputation for being able to spot a witch by signs invisible to others. After successfully accusing dozens of women, Janet herself was eventually accused and executed in 1597. Her own tactics turned against her. In some communities, women formed unofficial moral policing committees, keeping watch on their neighbors' behaviors and reporting anything suspicious. Midwives, who had legitimate reasons to be in other women's homes during vulnerable times, became both targets and accusers. A midwife who lost too many patients might be accused of witchcraft, but she might also protect herself by accusing others first. The German town of Würzburg provides a particularly heartbreaking example of women betraying women. In 1629, Eva Hohmann, a respected midwife, was tortured until she confessed to killing infants through witchcraft. Under further torture, she named 27 other women as accomplices. Many were her friends and clients, all were executed, and Eva herself died during her imprisonment. We must remember that these women weren't acting in a vacuum. They operated within a system that taught them to fear witchcraft as a real existential threat. Many genuinely believed they were protecting their communities from evil. Others were making rational, if terrible, choices within the limited options available to them. What's perhaps most unsettling about women's participation in witch hunts is how it reveals the effectiveness of oppressive systems. When people have little power, they often seek control where they can find it, even if that means turning against those who share their oppression. It's a painful testament to how thoroughly patriarchal systems could pit women against each other, making them complicit in their own subjugation. The women behind witch persecutions remind us that human behavior is rarely simple, and that survival sometimes demands terrible compromises. In understanding their choices, we gain insight not just into the witch hunts, but into how power and fear can corrupt any of us, regardless of gender. When the last witch-burning fires finally cooled, when the gallows stood empty and the prisons cleared of their accused, Europe and America were left to reckon with a terrible question. How did we let this happen? The witch hunts weren't just a historical footnote, they were a profound revelation of humanity's darkest capacities when in the grip of collective fear. The numbers alone tell a devastating story. Over 3 centuries, between 40,000 and 60,000 people were executed for a crime that never existed. Entire communities were decimated, bloodlines ended, knowledge lost, lives shattered, all because of imagined threats and manufactured enemies. But the legacy of the witch hunts goes far beyond the death toll. It fundamentally shaped our world in ways we're still untangling today. Consider justice systems. The horrors of witch trials eventually led to critical reforms in legal procedure. The concept of innocent until proven guilty, the right to legal representation, the rejection of torture as a means of obtaining confession, the requirement for material evidence rather than spectral claims. All these fundamental principles were strengthened in reaction to the obvious injustices of witch trials. In 1736, the last witch execution in England took place. Just 40 years later, the founders of America, deeply aware of the Salem Trials and European persecutions, enshrined protection against cruel and unusual punishment in the Constitution. Our modern understanding of civil liberties owes much to the terrible lessons learned from this dark chapter. The scientific revolution gained momentum partly as a rejection of the superstition that fueled witch hunts. When renowned scientist Robert Boyle witnessed a witch trial in 1652, he was so disturbed by the lack of empirical evidence that he devoted himself to promoting a more rational approach to understanding the world. The Royal Society, founded in 1660, explicitly set itself against superstition and in favor of experimentation and proof, a direct response to the unscientific thinking that had condemned thousands. There were economic consequences too. Regions that pursued witch hunts most aggressively often suffered significant financial decline. The German town of Ellwangen executed 400 people, nearly 10% of its population, and took almost a century to recover economically from the loss of workers, the cost of trials, and the atmosphere of suspicion that drove away trade. Perhaps most insidiously, the witch hunts reinvented misogyny, giving it pseudo-scientific and theological foundations that would echo for centuries. The most influential witch-hunting manual, the Malleus Maleficarum, contains page after page explaining why women are inherently more susceptible to the devil's influence, because they are weaker in mind and body, more impressionable, more carnal, and with slippery tongues. These stereotypes wormed their way into culture, literature, and even early psychology, creating lasting damage to how women were perceived and treated. But the witch hunts also sparked resistance. In 1631, poet Friedrich Spee, who had served as confessor to convicted witches, published Cautio Criminalis, a scathing critique of witch trials that outlined their fundamental injustice. He wrote it anonymously, knowing he would be persecuted for challenging the system. This book became one of the first human rights manifestos, arguing for the dignity and legal rights of even the most despised members of society. What's perhaps most chilling about the witch hunt era is how normal it all seemed to those living through it. Respectable community leaders, educated clergy, loving parents, all participated in or endorsed these atrocities. They weren't monsters. They were ordinary people convinced they were doing the right thing, protecting their communities from evil. And that's the most important legacy of all, the warning. The witch hunts demonstrate how easily a society can normalize cruelty when gripped by collective fear. How quickly neighbors can turn against neighbors. How efficiently persecution can be bureaucratized and systematized. How convincingly hatred can disguise itself as righteousness. We see echoes of witch hunt psychology throughout history. The Red Scare of the 1950s, when Americans accused their neighbors of communist sympathy on flimsy evidence. The Satanic Panic of the 1980s, when daycare workers were imprisoned based on impossible testimony. Even today, social media enables rapid spread of accusations that can destroy lives before facts are verified. Renowned historian Barbara Tuchman once observed that the witch hunts represented the most portentous example in Western history of mass delusion. Yet this delusion didn't require ignorance. It occurred against the backdrop of the Renaissance, among people who considered themselves enlightened. This is what makes the witch hunt legacy so essential to understand. It reveals our blind spots, our vulnerabilities to manipulation through fear, our capacity to abandon reason and compassion when we believe we're threatened. It shows how easily we can be convinced to see evil in others rather than examine the darkness in our systems or ourselves. When we study the witch hunts, we aren't just looking at distant history. We're looking into a mirror that reflects uncomfortable truths about human nature. The machinery of persecution that consumed the lives of those accused of witchcraft wasn't powered by malice alone, but by the most dangerous fuel of all, the absolute certainty of moral righteousness combined with unexamined fear. The legacy of the witch hunts isn't just about remembering those who suffered. It's about recognizing that the capacity for such persecution lives within all societies, and that vigilance against the politics of fear is not just a lesson from history, but a continuous, necessary practice for protecting our humanity. As we reach the end of this dark journey through history, what lessons can we take from these haunting tales of witch hunts? The answer might surprise you, and it's more relevant today than ever before. You see, the real evil was never about magic, spells, or supernatural powers. The true darkness lay in the hearts of ordinary people, twisted by fanaticism, prejudice, and the paralyzing fear of anything different from what they knew and understood. Think about it for a moment. These weren't just isolated incidents of persecution. This was an era when entire communities turned against their own neighbors, when a simple accusation could end a life, when fear became more powerful than reason. The witch hunts remind us how dangerous mass hysteria can be, how quickly society can turn against its most vulnerable members, how prejudice, once unleashed, can consume everything in its path like wildfire. But perhaps most importantly, these stories teach us to remain vigilant. In every age, there are those who would use fear to control others, who would point fingers at the different, the unusual, the non-conforming. The faces and targets may change, but the mechanism remains chillingly similar. The next time you hear someone being demonized for being different, remember the witch hunts. Remember how a simple accusation could destroy lives. Remember how entire communities were torn apart by suspicion and fear. These stories aren't just history, they're a warning from our ancestors echoing through the centuries. If this journey through the dark corners of history has opened your eyes, please take a moment to like this video and share it with others who might learn from these crucial lessons. Subscribe to Modern Age Chronicles for more untold stories that challenge what you think you know about history. Because remember, history isn't always what they told you it was. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and most importantly, keep your mind open to understanding those who are different from you. This is Modern Age Chronicles signing off.